Hello, everyone. My name is Morgan Korzik. I am currently a Master's of Forensic Science student at the University of New Haven, but I'm here to talk to you today about some research that was conducted while I was pursuing my BS degree at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, alongside Dr. John Bruno, Dr. Blair Steinwand, and Dr. Joel Faudrier. And we are talking to you about marketplace shrimp mislabeling in North Carolina. Now, many of you may already be aware of what seafood mislabeling is, but in case you are not, a brief definition is that seafood mislabeling occurs when a species is substituted with another type of seafood, usually one that's of a lower economic value. One thing to note is that seafood mislabeling can occur at any time between when seafood comes out of the water versus to when it ends up on your plate. Seafood mislabeling occurs worldwide, but as of 2019, 21% of seafood was being mislabeled in the United States. And there's quite a few negative consequences to seafood mislabeling, but three that are highlighted here are increasing the negative effects of overfishing, having negative impacts on human health, and even perpetuating human rights abuses and violations, particularly in international fisheries. Multiple studies have looked at seafood mislabeling, but one commonality has been utilizing DNA barcoding to actually quantify seafood mislabeling rates. Turning over to shrimp, shrimp is one of the most popular seafood items in the United States. Over 1 billion pounds of shrimp are consumed annually in the country. And shrimping has a deep cultural and economic tie, particularly to North Carolina. In 2017, the shrimping industry earned North Carolina almost $30 million. However, there has been a long-term decline in North Carolina's seafood industry, at least starting in 1995 and potentially continuing today. This decline is at least partially due to a pressure of seafood imports into the state. But despite this, 92% of North Carolina consumers still prefer to eat local seafood over imported seafood. So in response to that pressure from seafood imports, a couple organizations have popped up to conduct outreach to try to encourage consumers to still eat local seafood. NC Catch is one of those organizations that was worked with over the course of this study, and they're an advocacy organization that wants to provide information about vendors that sell local seafood to try to empower consumers to make informed decisions about their seafood purchases. So we believe that utilizing DNA barcoding techniques, we were wondering what the rate of local shrimp mislabeling was across North Carolina. And knowing that the national rate of shrimp mislabeling was about 35%, we anticipated that the state mislabeling rate would be similar. In terms of our methodology, the 6 main steps were sample collection, DNA extraction, PCR, which is polymerase chain reaction, gel electrophoresis, automated sequencing, and then finally species identification. In terms of sample collection, we collected 128 samples, 106 of them that were successfully sequenced from 31 inland and 29 coastal vendors. The samples were purchased from grocery stores and seafood markets, and the shrimp were collected when the vendor either explicitly or verbally confirmed that the shrimp was either local or North Carolina shrimp. So for example, if there was a label on the product already saying local or North Carolina, we took that as explicit confirmation. And if there was no label, then we would ask the vendor, is this local or North Carolina shrimp? And if they say yes, then it was purchased. These shrimp were collected during spring 2017, fall 2017, and spring 2018. 23 of the 60 vendors were sampled in multiple years or seasons. So for example, a vendor may have been initially sampled in spring 2017 and revisited fall 2017, or initially sampled spring 2017 and revisited back in spring 2018. For 10 of the vendors that sold more than one variety of shrimp, so for example, different sizes like small, medium, and large, or deveined and not deveined, we sampled more than one shrimp type from 10 of those vendors. This figure highlights the counties that were sampled from in North Carolina. So in red, you see the coastal counties that were sampled from, and in pink are the inland counties that were sampled from. And we specifically chose vendors that were NC Cash approved. So in the bottom right, you see our shrimp. So essentially we would collect these from the vendors, keep them cold in a cooler, bring them back to the lab, and put the shrimp flesh into these 2 milliliter screw cap vials that were stored in freezers to help preserve DNA. So from there, we extracted the DNA from the shrimp using a QIAGEN DN Easy kit, and those DNA extracts had the mitochondrial DNA cytochrome oxidase 1 gene amplified through PCR sequencing. So after the DNA was amplified through PCR, we ran that PCR product through a gel electrophoresis agarose plate looking for bands around 650 base pairs that would confirm that our CO1 gene actually did get amplified in the PCR process. So for samples that were successful for PCR, we sent them off to Eaton Bioscience in Raleigh, North Carolina, that performed automated sequencing for us. And essentially what they do is they fluorescently label the nucleotides so we can see a chromatogram of the species genome, specifically for the CO1 gene. So we received back chromatograms such as the one on the right from Eaton, and we ran these chromatograms through BLAST, which is in the NCBI website. So we determined a positive species identification when the percent identity and query coverage through the system were at least 98%, and there was an e-value close to 0. We also recorded the percent identity of the next species down to try to confirm that our positive species identification was supported. So when we received back species identity as Litopenaeus saitiferus, we deemed this the local North Carolina shrimp. And when the identity was Litopenaeus vanemi, we deemed this the Pacific white-leg shrimp. So after identifying these species, we divided them out into correctly labeled versus mislabeled samples. The correctly labeled samples were that Litopenaeus saitiferus, the Atlantic white-leg shrimp, or the Atlantic white shrimp, which is the local shrimp, and this accounted for 66% of our samples. Mislabeled shrimp were the Litopenaeus vanemi, the Pacific white-leg shrimp, which accounted for 34% of our samples, and these shrimp were assumed to be imported, not fresh, and likely farmed. This is an overview of the 60 vendors that we sampled from. 35% of those vendors mislabeled shrimp at least once. So this includes vendors that were only visited the one time or were visited multiple times, but those vendors had mislabeled shrimp for at least one of the times that we visited them. And in the darker red, you see that 65% of the vendors that we visited never mislabeled their shrimp, and they were always local shrimp. So of the 106 samples that were successfully sequenced, 47 of those were from inland vendors and 59 from coastal, and there was no statistical difference between the mislabeling rates for inland or coastal vendors. And of those vendors that were resampled multiple times, 6 of them actually sold both correctly labeled and mislabeled shrimp, which could lead to an assumption that perhaps these vendors changed their supplier, or the supplier started mislabeling shrimp or not mislabeling shrimp when they had been doing the other previously. In terms of price, the mean price of mislabeled shrimp, which you see as the incorrect section of figure 2, was $11 per pound, while the mean price of correctly labeled shrimp was $13.20 per pound. And this difference was statistically significant. So this could suggest that vendors either knowingly or subconsciously place this lower market value on these mislabeled shrimp, which could tell consumers that if the shrimp is of a lower price, it may be more likely to not actually be local shrimp. Now, why does this all matter? So I'm going to highlight the differences between locally caught white shrimp and these imported Pacific white shrimp to highlight that to you. So these locally caught white shrimp are deemed a smart seafood choice by the NOAA. They are sustainably harvested and managed in both the South Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. Their populations are pretty high and above the target levels as of right now, and there are gear restrictions in place, including turtle excluder devices and bycatch reduction devices that help minimize the devastative effects of trawling. And conversely, the imported Pacific white-leg shrimp are harvested through trawling and they have high levels of bycatch, especially because there really aren't any gear restrictions in place. There are multiple environmental risks, including mangrove destruction and reducing biodiversity. And when these shrimp are farmed, the Pacific farms often use large doses of antibiotics that are not necessarily advised for human use in the United States. So these shrimp could be farmed or wild caught, but regardless, they still have ties to slavery practices. So slave fishing can be used to directly catch wild caught shrimp, or more often, it's used to catch fish that are then used to feed these farmed shrimp. In terms of areas for further research, there are many directions that this could continue to go. One question we had was following up with vendors who mislabeled at least once, trying to see if that vendor realized that they were mislabeling or if their supplier was the one who was causing the mislabeling, or even if the supplier was causing that, essentially trying to pinpoint the moment in the chain where that mislabeling occurred. We were also wondering if mislabeling rates changed during different seasons because some of the vendors that we revisited didn't mislabel at first and then mislabeled later, or the opposite. So we were wondering if maybe a change in consumer demand or perhaps a change in their supplier caused a change in the actual species identity of this local shrimp. We're also curious about mislabeling rates of other popular seafood, of course, other than just shrimp. And we were wondering what the effectiveness is of NC Catch and other organizations. So do these vendors only mislabel this local shrimp, or are there other seafoods that they're mislabeling that is simply going through the cracks and needs to be addressed? Here are a list of the references that were utilized during this presentation if you are curious about them. And thank you for your time. If you can't make it to the Q&A and you have any questions for myself or Dr. John Bruno, our emails are here, so you can certainly contact us. And have a great day.